Owls are often made to seem like birds of mystery, but really, we know an awful lot about them, thanks to something called owl pellets. An owl pellet is a tight ball of all the undigestible material that an owl can't eat. Usually, it's made up of fur, bones, claws, teeth, or even feathers if an owl has eaten a bird. And these are formed because an owl does not have something called a crop like most birds do. So looking at my drawing of my owl, we see that I have drawn out the digestive tract. Digestion always begins in the mouth. So as the owl swallows its prey in either big chunks or even whole, it is swallowed and goes down the esophagus, this first line right here. Then it goes into something called the Proventriculus. The Proventriculus then starts to break apart the prey and keeping all of the good stuff and the stuff it can't digest separate. The stuff that it can digest, which would be the skin, muscles, internal organs, and other soft body parts of its prey, go on down to the ventriculus or the stomach. And here, the food begins to break down even further, and then it goes through the intestinal system where all of the nutrients are absorbed through the owl's body. Eventually, the waste is excreted through an opening in the owl's rear called the vent. But what about all that stuff that wasn't able to be digested still up here in the proventriculus? All of it is collected and squashed together until eventually a pellet forms. And as an owl is getting ready to take its next meal, it needs to make room in the proventriculus, so it will cough up the pellet, sort of like throwing up, and that leaves an empty space for its next meal. So even though owls are nocturnal, meaning they come out at night, looking at these owl pellets actually gives us a really big insight as to what they spend their time preying on while they fly around on silent wings at nighttime. When it comes to actually dissecting your owl pellet, there's only a couple things that you need, and all of these are going to be included in your kit. First and foremost, you need your owl pellet, which is this object wrapped in foil. You're going to want a paper plate or a paper towel to catch all of the fur, feathers, and other contents of your owl pellet. To pull apart different things inside the pellet, you're going to want some toothpicks. And then for identification of what you find, you're going to want some sort of bone chart, something that lets you know what it is you're looking at. So to get started, all you're going to do is unwrap the owl pellet. And these have all been sterilized, so you don't need to worry about getting some gross disease from these owl pellets. However, it is a good idea to go ahead and wash your hands after handling the owl pellets, just to be on the safe side. So this is what it looks like. It doesn't look very appetizing. It's pretty tough, which is where the toothpicks with the pointed end come in handy for picking apart all of this material. But remember, this is all of the stuff that the owl can't digest whenever they have a meal. This is going to be feathers or fur, depending on if they ate a bird or a mammal. It's going to be bones and teeth. And with all of that material compacted inside of this little pellet, you can actually tell exactly what it was that the owl ate before they coughed up this pellet. So when you get started, you can do this one of two ways. Some people like to use two toothpicks, one to hold it and one to break it apart. Some people like to use their hand to hold it, and they just use one toothpick to very gently pull it apart. And some people, like myself, will use a combination of all three. So I will start with looking to see where there might be some bones that could fall out just nice and even from the surface. There's one right there. And then very carefully just picking away the layers to see what I can find. Now, one thing I will make sure to point out is I highly recommend that you keep doing this on a paper plate. If you were to do this on a table and then later you sweep all of the stuff off with your hands. I have had students before in the past get little pieces of fur or even bones stuck in their skin like a splinter, and that's no fun. So if you can keep it in a paper plate, it keeps all of the mess contained and you don't have to clean off the table as much whenever you're done. So you just start picking away, and before you realize it, you're gonna find a lot more than you ever imagined possible inside this tiny little unassuming pellet. What it is I've got inside. Some stuff is going to come out in pieces, while other pieces we're gonna be fortunate enough to get them all out in one whole piece. And on one side of my plate, I do have the bones that I'm able to separate, and then on the other side, I have the fur and other indistinguishable material that really doesn't help with identification. Looking at the different bones that we have in our owl pellet can tell us exactly what kind of rodent or other animal that the owl ate. And that's where the bone chart is going to come in handy once we've got this owl pellet completely dissected. As I go along, I'm starting to group bones that I think look similar. And once I have all of the bones laid out next to one another, then I'll start going through and trying to identify which parts of the skeleton the bones belong to. But right now, I'm not too concerned with trying to figure out if I have a complete skeleton in front of me or not. Sometimes an owl pellet can contain several meals in one, so it may not always create a clear image of what was eaten when. You may get skeletons from one animal mixed in with the other. This owl pellet is very compacted. It's squished very tightly together, so I'm having to go very slowly in order not to crack the bones that are inside. Yours may be easier to open than mine is. One thing I will not recommend is getting your owl pellet wet or soaking it beforehand. That may introduce any bacteria growth that we just don't want. And like I said, these have been sterilized to the best of the Biological Society's ability, but when dealing with something from an animal, it's always best to be as careful as possible. So keep it dry, don't get it soaking in water, don't spray it down with water, and always wash your hands once you are done with your dissection. nice up close look at our rodent skull. This right here came from probably a mouse. So if we're looking at it, here is the tip of the nose, and down below it are those orange incisors, the front teeth. And then moving on back, this would be the top of the head. And if we turn it, we see these two bones on the side. Those are the bones protecting the eyes. And then underneath we have the top jaw with all of those molars used for grinding up food. Okay, so I have separated out as best as I possibly can all of my owl pellet feather and furs, as well as the bones that I found. And I tried to group them based on what they looked like in similarities. So here I've got some bones that are curved. Here I know that I've got some jaw bones because they have teeth on them. Over here I have a partial skull. And then up here are various bones that had similar features. And I have a pretty good guess as to what they could be. But nothing would be able to be accomplished as far as identification goes if I didn't have a bone chart. So even biologists who spend their time looking at owl pellets and studying small mammals and other critters, they have to use books and charts just like this one to figure out what it is exactly they're looking at. So this is a tool that helps us identify clues that nature leaves behind for us. Up at the top, we have different skulls that can be found in owl pellets, starting with a shrew, which was a very small mammal that eats insects and worms. Larger rodents like the brown rat are a possibility. You might see something like a red-winged blackbird, which we do have here in Kansas City. A vole is another insectivore mammal that crawls around in the ground. And then, of course, most commonly, we're going to find something like a house mouse or a deer mouse. And down here are examples of bones from the brown rat. And using this chart right here, we can group our bones together to get a complete look of what we found. So one thing that I was really excited to find was a partial skull that I was able to extract from the owl pellet. It is a little busted up, but that's pretty normal. These bones on the skull are very, very, very thin, and they crack incredibly easy. The front teeth of a rodent are always going to be orange. Those front teeth are the incisors. So think about your front teeth in your mouth. And those are what are used to bite and break off pieces of their food. And because they're orange, that gives us a clue that this is a rodent. Only rodents have these orange front incisors. And these teeth also grow the entire life of the rodent. So if you've ever wondered why mice and rats chew on anything they can find, not only is it for them to find food and shelter and get places they're not supposed to be, but also to keep those teeth worn down, like using a nail file on your fingernail. And those teeth make sure that they stay nice and short. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and this is not as big as the brown rat skull, so I'm gonna put it over here with the house mouse because that's the best guess that we have today. Rats are quite large, and a mouse is more in line with the size of this skull. In addition to finding the top part of the skull, I also found some bottom jaws. So if we move this up just a little bit, right down here we've got the bottom jaw of our house mouse, and on each skull there's going to be two bottom jaws. So I've got one side, and then I was able to find the other side. Now that gives me roughly a full skull inside one owl pellet. But what happens if you are dissecting and later you find another piece of a skull? For instance, I found another lower jaw bone. That just tells me that the owl had more than one mammal in a single night, and it just happened to get put together into the owl pellet that I dissected. I'll put this with our house mouse, just so we know that there was more than one individual that this owl ate. Okay, let's move on to the next bone that you are most likely to see. There's going to be several of them. That's going to be this curved, really skinny shaped bone. This is part of the rib cage, which protects all of the soft organs inside of the body. If you feel your sides, you should feel bumps running up and down the length of your torso, and that is your own rib cage. Now, there are several ribs in the skeleton of any mammal, and that is really obvious to see when you look at how many different rib bones I found in this one little pellet. They're all of different sizes. Some curve a little bit differently than others, and that just depends on where they are found in the rib cage. So all these little bones right here, these are all ribs. I found a lot. Okay, moving on, let's move down the line this way to another set of bones that also gives you a clue as to how many individuals are found inside these owl pellets. So starting with the tibia and the fibula, then we've got the humerus. You may have heard of the humerus. This is connected to your funny bone on your elbow. So this is the forearm leg bone. Moving on to the femur. The femur is your leg bone, or the back legs of a rodent. And then up here is the pelvic bone. The femur is really easy to identify because it has this little ball joint at the top that fits into this socket joint right here on the pelvic bone. And if you take a look at this bone right here, I know it's a little blurry, I'll put a picture in so you can see better. There is the little ball joint. So that tells us that this is a femur. And if this was a complete skeleton, we would be able to put it right into the pelvic bone. So I'm gonna put this femur bone right here. I was able to find 2 of them. More than likely they belong to the same critter, but there's a chance that it's different. And unfortunately, I did not find a pelvic bone today, but you would be able to identify it because it would have this wide back space and then an open oval up here at the top. And then remember that ball socket for this ball joint to fit into nicely. The humerus is also pretty easy to identify because it's gonna have this little hump right up here at the top. So if I go back to my dissected owl pellet and I come up here, you can see I did find one humerus bone that gives me another piece of my skeletal puzzle. Found another one. That one is a little more broken, but that's okay. And surprisingly, I found a third one. The tibia and the fibula are very hard to find intact because the fibula is an incredibly tiny little bone. So you can barely see it right there. I know it's kind of blurry, but this bone right here is the fibula, this really tiny skinny one, and then this one here on the back is the tibia. The scapula is the shoulder blade. So if you were to reach behind your back and feel your shoulder blades, it would feel like this flat disc right on the side, either side of your neck. So I did find a scapula, very thin bone, very easy to break. And I think I found a second one. However, this one is a lot tinier than the first one. So I'm gonna guess that these came from 2 different rodents. Okay, so no pelvic bone, 2 femurs, 3 humerus bones, 1 tibia and fibula, a pile of ribs, 2 scapula, probably from different individuals. And the last bone we haven't talked about yet is vertebra. Now, vertebrae are parts of the backbone. The backbone is able to move in different directions and stretch if needed to, and it's very strong. And the reason it can have so much mobility is because it's lots of little bones all stacked on top of each other, connected by muscles and nerves and other fibrous tissue. This right here is a collection of vertebrae from a deer, much larger than anything we would find in an owl pellet. But as you notice, they're all strung together with string through a hole right here in the middle. That is where the spinal cord would go down, and along the sides, a lot of different muscles and nerves and fibrous tissue would connect, allowing them to bend. And again, they can stretch ever so slightly if you ever needed to move in such a way as to keep you safe or to get exactly what you needed food-wise. Unfortunately, I didn't find any vertebra in my owl pellet. It's possible that I did find a part of one, so we'll put it there, but that's pretty normal. You don't always get the full picture.
Jumping to a different bone chart, I have 2 more bones for us, the ulna and the radius. The radius is the first bone on the left, and the ulna is on the right. These bones are the front limb bones that connect to the humerus bone, and at the end would be the feet. In the skeleton, the radius and ulna sit side by side. The ulna is the bigger one with a curved C shape on one end, and this is where the humerus connects. The radius is slightly thicker and shorter than the ulna. I hope you enjoyed this owl pellet dissection and you learned something new. You can keep your dissection in a plastic bag or in a jar if you want to look at it later. Otherwise, you can just throw it away when you're done. If you want to learn more about owls, check out our online catalog and reserve your owl books for curbside pickup. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.